Hello, fellow sorcerers. I wanted to introduce you to a sorcery deck comparison tool that I made to allow for the comparison of two different decks on Curiosa.io. The tool is live at sorcerydeckdiff.com, and all you need to do is copy-paste two Curiosa deck URLs into the Deck A and Deck B prompts, hit Compare Decks, and you'll see a visual representation of the two. This was made to help in deck building for comparing two versions of a deck, or if you're just curious as to how similar two different decks are. Like this. So this is just two different decks that I pulled, and you'll see one deck A is shown on the left, deck B is shown on the right. All the right column, all of the cards in common are in the center column, and you can hover over and see the card. Obviously, the multiplicity of is shown here for the one for deck A. For this violin, it would be 3, and for deck B, it'd be 4, for example. So you can see real differences of two different decks. And so this one just is showing two different recent sort of Steam Druid decks, I guess, and the different, all the shared minions and what's different about them. So the idea of this, and also the sites, you also get a deck similarity down at the bottom, and then a mana distribution at the very bottom. So the idea behind this is that you could use this to compare two different decks that are out in the wild like this, or use it for deck building where you iterate over decks and you make changes on Curiosa, and you want to sort of visualize the changes that you've made and see how much or how little you've actually changed. So this would be a tool to sort of help do that. After comparing two decks pairwise, we can extend this idea to compare multiple decks pairwise and draw a network of similar decks like the one shown. The network shown here is constructed from the top 4 decks from competitions self-reported in the title of the decks on Curiosa. Each node is a deck, and deck edges are the similarity that was shown on the DeckDiff website. Specifically, the statistic used to compare two different decks is the fraction of cards that are shared across the two decks over the total cards across the two decks. So that becomes our similarity statistic, and we can draw an edge between two different decks if they're above a certain threshold of that statistic, and we figure out the threshold by looking at all pairs of decks with the assumption that most decks should not be similar. And so these have sort of the lower values on that hump, and then it sort of tapers off around 0.3 to 0.5, which is sort of where the thresholds are selected to retain only the related decks. Now, with this clustering of the top 4 finishing decks of different competitions, we can start identifying different archetypes by clusters. So one of the first clusters that emerges is the Archimago cluster. Then we also see an Avatar of Air cluster, as well as the Steam Druid cluster, followed by a Fury Road type cluster, and Air Earth mid-range kind of cluster, and then a Pathfinder cluster, and several other decks that don't cluster nicely but are sort of scattered around as singletons, or maybe a single pairwise edge here and there. But yeah, so these sort of larger clusters are very identifiable archetypes that have been identified by the community, and that was kind of a nice sort of way of that it sort of self-organized into these archetypes. So this going into this Archimago one sort of is the easiest one to go at. It's a hairball. You can see they're all highly connected to one another. If we just click on one of them, we see sort of an aggregate deck breakdown for all of the 16 decks that are in that cluster, and we can see the count of each card in that cluster, the percentage, and you can also see the distribution. So in this case, we can see that 6 decks ran 2 counts of Chains of Prometheus, while the remaining 10 decks didn't run it at all. So you also have the distribution of usage as that little icon over, in the columns. And so what we can see here is, this one's maybe not surprising because it was a hairball, so they're all very similar. But if you look down at the magic for the Archimago, there's a whole bunch of spells that are all just the same, right? Everyone's running them. And this is not particularly surprising. But we can sort of see there is sort of a split. There's about half that sort of splash some kind of fire. But yeah, that's this Archimago hairball. The other highly connected sort of hairball is this Avatar of Air. So if we look at this, you have sort of some artifacts that are very common. The magic's a little more split. So there isn't, aside from Grapple Shot, which is also not surprising, but then the minions are highly similar, as well as the sites, and that's probably because these are mostly mono air, and there's only so many air minions that sort of fit the theme. So that's not maybe particularly surprising. Then if we keep moving along here to these clusters, this group is Steam Druid, so another popular one right now. So we can see the breakdown here where every single one of them runs Tor's Hammer Trinket, but interestingly, not every single one runs Ring of Morrigan. So that's sort of interesting. Maybe there are a couple tournaments that banned it on their own. I don't know. But that's an interesting note. If we continue looking, there's so Disintegrate was one of the few magics that were completely used in all decks, while Valimp and Boudica and Morgana were the minions that were in all of the decks. These are all very strong cards, so it's not surprising. But then it sort of starts to taper off on the magic. But the minions, there's a lot of minions that are all sort of the strong, fast red and a couple of blue ones. So these are also not particularly surprising. They're all highly similar, it seems. And if we go down to the sites, then yeah, again, not particularly surprising. These are all highly similar in this Steam Druid sort of deck. So if we move over here to this group, this is sort of the Fury Road. So you can see the Fury Road highlighted in here a couple of times. But so it's Fury Road, Sorcerer, and Pathfinder, which is kind of interesting. So if we group these are there's 11 decks, so there's a core of magic that's used between them. There's the Root Spider, Violent that are in all of them. And then the sort of expected sites. So this is also sort of expected, but an interesting one. And this is also a mixture of the 50-30 and 40-20, since that's sort of when Fury Road came out. Maybe some decks were updated. So it forms this kind of chain of cluster in it. So if we keep moving over here, we find this sort of air-earth mid-range. The interesting thing about this one, kind of similar to the Fury Road one, is that it's multiple avatars. So you have this Avatar of Air, the Druid, and then some Avatar of Earths. And if we look at them, there is still a lot of similarity. Oh, look at this. Tor's Hammers equal to that of Ring in this case. So they're sort of on par in terms of usage for not just this cluster, but the Steam Druid one. So maybe it's more of the archetype. But these show a lot of similarity in the magic. Look at this. I mean, these are ones that you would want to include, but, and also the minions, Pudgy, the Pudge Butcher, Root Spider. These are all, I mean, again, these are not particularly surprising, but it's maybe surprising that it's spread across 3 avatars that you might not, that maybe wouldn't initially associate. To be fair, there were 2 different clusters. There was the Steam Druid cluster that had the Druid. There was the avatar of sort of the mono air avatar of air cluster that had its own cluster. So this is like its own archetype with similar cards but different avatars. And so one of the reasons why I wanted to do this network comparison was to really look at things like this, connections like this, where you have a pretty high degree of similarity, but completely different avatars that perform well. So then if we look at this, at these 2, the first place in Cornerstone and 3rd place at Gen Con. So this is the avatar of air, and this is the Druid. And we scroll, we see there is a lot of similarity in the minions. There's a lot of similarity overall, but the minions, you can see where the differences are. The magic, it's drop some counts, add some variety for the deck on the right. And then the sites are largely similar. And that brings us to a pretty high, so like the distinct cards are even more similar than the total cards. The total cards take into account the frequency as well. And the mana distribution's slightly different, but very similar. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. These are the kinds of ones that were the most interesting to look at. So then if we look at the same same Druid to compare it to an avatar of Earth, we see, again, it's not the same set, it's a different set, because this avatar of Earth and this avatar of Air are not connected, right? So they're not as similar. But you see a lot of similarity in the minions, and actually the interesting, so the avatar of Earth took more magic versus the avatar of, or the Druid took more minions. So that's like an interesting observation that pops out pretty clearly from this. So this is a little less similar, but still quite similar. So then the last sort of larger cluster. So there's a couple of clusters of 3 that I'm not going to look at, but this other larger cluster is this Pathfinder one, which is sort of interesting. Some of these may be this may be actually an effectively smaller cluster than it's giving on. So these 2 things that are 100 or 1.0 are identical. So this could just be an artifact of double posting a deck or actually net decking. But I think in this case it's just the same, like maybe a placeholder that someone put up for the event. So this is effectively smaller, but still interesting to see what was similar in these what converged in these Pathfinder decks. And then the final part is so those are sort of the 6 clusters that naturally fell out. There were obviously other ones. So this is like a small Death Speaker one. This guy is not part of it. There's other small clusters, but really there's a lot of diversity in all of these singletons that are out here. So even though it was easier to highlight the clusters and the similarity of decks that sort of group together naturally. But there are quite a few that did well in events that are very distinct from one another. So that's also great to see. So that's sort of the 7th group, is everything else, which is nice to see. So thanks for taking the time to watch this, and let me know if this is something that would be of interest to the community. I might be able to try to figure out some way to release it if there's enough interest. And yeah, thanks again for watching.